Managing firewall rules across multiple Azure services can be complex, especially when Microsoft updates the IP range address ranges for its cloud components. Now, manual updates leads to operational overhead, inconsistencies, and potential security exposure. And the IP ranges that we receive are from the Microsoft website, wherein we have to explicitly download the corresponding ranges and validate them in the corresponding tag aspect. So this is the IP JSON that gets downloaded from that corresponding website, wherein one has to explicitly parse across for the corresponding action group and the region. Post extracting that corresponding IP range, one has to explicitly come and add those IP. So in this case, for storage account, one has to explicitly add IPv4 address, and in case of SQL Server, the start and the end IP. So the first aspect of our project is extract the data from that website, parse that corresponding JSON, and load the data into the corresponding Fabric SQL database in the form of flat format. So now we have created a translytical workflow via which any admin can add the corresponding configurations with respect to, for this project scope, it is just SQL and storage account, the corresponding offering name, and then he or she can click on the corresponding invoke aspect. What this does is it goes and writes the data into this corresponding configuration table, and a trigger has been set up on top of this table. On insert of this trigger, a stored procedure is triggered. Now, what that stored procedure does is it triggers an Azure function via the external REST endpoint functionality in the Fabric SQL database. So now the corresponding data got inserted, a trigger was initiated, and now the corresponding IPs would have been whitelisted in the corresponding SQL server in an automated way rather than a manual way. Now, similar can be done for the storage account as well, wherein as of now it's blank. Post my corresponding storage account type and trigger, it would again do the same functionality wherein the data would get inserted in this corresponding configuration table. It would go ahead and trigger the Azure function, and via the Azure function, the IPs are whitelisted by scanning for the corresponding IP for the Power BI component in the Australia Central region. So now the corresponding request was submitted, and in case if we go ahead and refresh the corresponding IP aspect, it would have been whitelisted in the corresponding storage account. Now we can also check the log aspect with respect to the trigger responses. So the initial response was, since it's the first time that we are adding the record, the action for the corresponding IP was to add those corresponding IP addresses. And this was the response that we received from the corresponding Azure SQL Server, wherein these firewall rules, Azure function, wherein these fire rules were added into the corresponding SQL Server. Now, scope 2 of the initiative is, let's say that some of the IPs for the corresponding component and region type got deleted or updated. Then the system would automatically extract the data on a scheduled basis, compare the difference across the original IP and the new IP range, and in case if for that corresponding offering and offering name type combination there has been any change, and that combination is already part of our config table, it would take the necessary action of either adding or removing those additional IPs from the existing scope. So for this, I'll be initially deleting an IP from the destination table and updating one of the record to identify the case of an insert and a delete scenario of a new IP. So now this pipeline would be scheduled. What this pipeline does is it gets to the corresponding IP Microsoft website, extracts the corresponding URL that is needed for the download, which is dynamic, then passes that data to a notebook. What that notebook does is extracts the data from that corresponding URL JSON, flattens it, and loads it into the staging table. Post that, there is a stored procedure that compares for the delta changes whether there has been any insert or update across the data. And in case of insert, then the corresponding via external REST endpoint, the Azure function REST API is called in case if that combination exists in the configuration table, and goes ahead and inserts those corresponding new IPs into the respective offering values. And in case of a delete, it goes ahead and deletes those corresponding one from the already existing aspect. So the pipeline was successful. And then in case if I go and check the Azure function responses, I can see that for the corresponding SQL and storage account, there was Power BI Australia Central for which the IPs were deleted. So there are two remove actions across SQL and storage. And there was one additional IP that got inserted, hence there are two add records. So this solution not only helps in automation of adding IPs to the offerings in the first instance,